Okay, so I want to talk about risk management in the project management context. Now, every organization will have its own risk management framework, risk management methodology, and included as part of that will be steps that you need to take, documentation that you need to complete, and so forth. I'm going to just talk about a general risk management approach and incorporate that within the context of project management. So, risk management is is the way that we identify risks in the scope of what we're doing, how we assess those risks so that we can prioritize and manage them differently, and then how we do treat those risks. That is what we do regarding those risks, how we, for example, how we may eliminate those risks or how we may mitigate those risks, and then how we follow up and keep an eye on them to ensure that if they change, we're doing that whole process again. So really, fundamentally, it's risk management is the process of managing that risks. And in this context, we're really thinking about that in the scope of the project. So what is it that we're trying to achieve? What are the actions that we're doing? What are things that can upset um, our our objective of achieving those things, and how should we manage those? So if we look at the risk management context and framework, we can this diagram represents it fairly clearly. So at the top here, we establish the context of our risk management. And in this case, the context is really as defined by our scope of the project. And of course, just assuming that as this is undertake project work, we're assuming that we're either a senior officer and we've got a significant control within the scope of the project, or we're responsible for the project ourselves. So that context for us will be within the scope of our project. So everything that's within scope, we should really be thinking about that in terms of the risks associated with that. And as I mentioned earlier, this part of the process should be aligned with the planning process. So as we're thinking about the planning process, what is it that we need to do and how are we going to go about doing that, we should be thinking about the risk element with it. So once we establish that context, which is the project, we think about the planning process and the actions that we're going to take. Then we can start to identify if there are any risks. What are some of the things that can go wrong? How seriously do we take those possibilities? So in terms of, is it likely? And if it does happen, what are the consequences? And we assess those risks based really on those two criteria in terms of likelihood and consequences. And then we make a determination on what we think that risk is, and then we take action on that. And that's really that: identify the risks, analyze the risks, evaluate the risks, and then treat the risks. And they're the risk management steps, and I'll talk more about those in a moment. Those two pillars on the left hand side, communicate and consult, and monitor and review, encompass the whole framework. So we, through this, identify risks, analyze risks, evaluate risks, and treat risks in particular, we're really consulting with key stakeholders. So we're talking to the project team, we're talking to maybe the sponsor or some of the other key stakeholders such as suppliers or consultants, and we're determining what are things that can go wrong. So for example, you're undertaking your planning for your project. One of those steps within your plan is about accessing resources. You're thinking about suppliers, potential suppliers. You're thinking about things that can go wrong in terms of the supply chain. It will have a detrimental effect to our project if we can't get a particular resource here on time. So we may start to consult. We might talk to some of our suppliers. We'll do some research, especially if it's an imported supply. Are there delays in terms of getting them into the country and so forth? And we start to do our research through consultation, and we also push out information in that process as well. So we communicate and we consult. And that can start from the context establishment, but really in a project, that context should be defined by our project scope or our project implementation documentation, all that stuff in phase one. But really it becomes important, the consultation and communication becomes critical through that. Identify, analyze, evaluate, and treat the risks. And then the other pillar on the right-hand side of this diagram is the monitor and review. We should be monitoring and reviewing the whole context and risk assessment process throughout the life of the project, because the risks will change throughout the project. So a supplier, if I continue on with that same example, a supplier that we deem to be low risk at the start of the project could potentially change through the life of the project. So there might be, so for example, the pandemic hits, COVID hits, it disrupts the supply chain, and then all of a sudden that supply and supplier are no longer a low risk. The likelihood of something being delayed increases, the consequences may still remain the same, which might be high, and then all of a sudden the risk assessment changes. So we then have to change our approach or the way that we treat that risk. So the assessment of risks should be something that we do all along the life of the project. We monitor those risks and we review those, and we adjust our assessments as required.